Yo, what's happening everyone? So I need to tell you about what went down on SportsCenter this morning because honestly, I was not expecting the conversation to take this direction at all, and I'm still fired up about everything that was discussed. I had just finished watching the New York Knicks lose in overtime to the Indiana Pacers in one of the most embarrassing losses of the season, made myself some coffee to calm down from the frustration, turned on ESPN to catch SportsCenter's analysis of the game, and there was the crew getting ready to discuss what went wrong for the Knicks and why they struggled so badly against one of the worst teams in the league. But instead of just breaking down the defensive lapses or talking about how the Knicks couldn't close out the game, they pivoted into this absolutely unexpected discussion about whether the Knicks should be pursuing Tyus Jones in free agency to add some much-needed backcourt depth and leadership to help solve their consistency problems. And man, the way this entire segment unfolded had me sitting there completely engaged because they were covering everything from the Knicks' offensive struggles when Jalen Brunson sits to their need for a veteran facilitator to whether adding a smart, steady point guard like Jones makes sense when you're trying to compete for a championship in the Eastern Conference. Hey, what's up everyone? Real quick before we get into everything, that like button is literally what determines if this reaches hundreds or thousands of fans. Takes 1 second, but makes a huge impact on the channel's growth. Just smash that like button right now. It's the easiest thing you can do, but honestly the biggest way to support this content, every single like pushes this further, so hit it now. The show opened in this really frustrated way because instead of immediately jumping into the Tyus Jones discussion, the SportsCenter anchors started by breaking down what happened in that Pacers game and why it was so unacceptable. They were talking about how the Knicks lost to a 14-win Pacers team in overtime at home, how they allowed Indiana to shoot 40% from 3, and how their defense was absolutely non-existent. The anchors were explaining how Jalen Brunson finally said the quiet part out loud after the game when he admitted it was a defensive problem, and how refreshing it was to hear someone actually call out what everyone could see. One of the anchors jumped in and started breaking down the specific defensive failures and why the Knicks have struggled with consistency all season. He was talking about how Pascal Siakam did whatever he wanted against the Knicks, how they couldn't get stops when they needed them, and how they shot poorly in the fourth quarter and overtime. The anchor was making this really compelling point about how the Knicks have all this talent, but they can't put together complete games, and that's going to be a major problem if they want to compete in the playoffs. Another anchor came in and started talking about the depth issues and why that's been such a concern for the Knicks. She was explaining how the Knicks rely so heavily on their starters, how their bench production has been inconsistent, and how they don't have anyone who can really facilitate the offense when Jalen Brunson goes to the bench. She was breaking down how championship teams need multiple players who can run the offense and make the right decisions, and right now, the Knicks don't have that. The first anchor brought the conversation specifically to Tyus Jones, and this is where things got really interesting. He started explaining Jones' situation and why he would be such a perfect fit for what the Knicks need. He was talking about how Jones is a veteran point guard who doesn't need the ball in his hands constantly, how he has one of the best assist-to-turnover ratios in the league, and how he's exactly the type of smart, steady player the Knicks are missing. The anchor was really emphasizing how Jones wouldn't cost a lot of money and would be available in free agency without giving up any assets. The female anchor jumped back in and started talking about why the Knicks specifically need someone like Tyus Jones to fix their offensive issues. She was explaining how the Knicks offense stalls out when Brunson sits, how they don't have anyone who can run pick and rolls effectively in those situations, and how Jones has proven throughout his career that he can run an offense efficiently. She made this point about how Jones wouldn't try to do too much. He would just make the right play every single time, and that's exactly what the Knicks need from their backup point guard. The other anchor interrupted and started talking about the basketball IQ aspect and why that's so valuable. He was explaining how Jones has always been one of the smartest players on the court, how he rarely makes mistakes, and how that kind of veteran presence would help the younger players on the Knicks bench. The anchor was making this argument about how teams that win championships have veterans who understand how to play winning basketball, and Jones is exactly that type of player. The first anchor came back and started discussing how Tyus Jones would specifically help in the game they just played against the Pacers. He was explaining how the Knicks couldn't execute in crunch time, how they made poor decisions with the ball, and how having someone like Jones who never panics and always makes the right read would have made a huge difference. The anchor was arguing that the Knicks lost that game because of poor execution and decision-making, and Jones solves exactly those problems. The female anchor got back in there and started talking about the financial aspect of potentially signing Tyus Jones. She was explaining how Jones isn't going to command a max contract or anything close to it, how the Knicks have some financial flexibility, and how adding a veteran point guard on a reasonable deal would be a smart move. She made this point about how sometimes the best moves aren't the flashy ones, they're the smart complementary signings that fill specific needs. The other anchor jumped in and started talking about Mike Brown's comments after the game and how that connects to needing better players. He was explaining how Brown talked about needing better physicality and communication, but how sometimes you just need better players who understand how to execute. The anchor was making this argument about how coaching can only do so much, and at some point you need players who have the experience and IQ to make plays when it matters. The first anchor then shifted the conversation to talk about how Tyus Jones would fit alongside Jalen Brunson. He was explaining how Jones wouldn't take anything away from Brunson, how he would complement him perfectly by being able to run the offense when Brunson rests, and how they could even play together in some lineups. The anchor was arguing that having two smart point guards who can both facilitate would give the Knicks so much more flexibility with their rotations. The female anchor came back and started discussing the leadership aspect and what Jones would bring to the locker room. She was talking about how the Knicks have some young players who need guidance, how they need veterans who can teach them how to be professionals, and how Jones has that reputation throughout the league. She was explaining how championship teams have multiple leaders, and Jones could be exactly that for the Knicks' second unit. The other anchor started getting more analytical, and he was talking about Jones' stats and what he brings to the table. He was showing how Jones has consistently been one of the best assist-to-turnover ratio guys in the league, how he doesn't turn the ball over, and how that kind of ball security is crucial in playoff basketball. The anchor was making this point about how the Knicks turn the ball over too much in crucial situations, and Jones would help fix that. The first anchor brought up the upcoming game against the 76ers and how that shows why the Knicks need more depth. He was explaining how the Knicks have to play Philadelphia on the second night of a back-to-back after an exhausting overtime game, and how they don't have enough quality depth to handle that kind of schedule. The anchor was arguing that having someone like Jones would allow them to rest Brunson more and keep everyone fresh for important games. The female anchor jumped back in and started talking about the playoff implications of adding a player like Jones. She was explaining how in playoff basketball, having multiple guys who can run your offense is crucial, and how the Knicks would be in serious trouble if anything happened to Brunson. She made this really passionate argument about how you can't go into the playoffs with only one guy who can facilitate, and Jones would give them insurance and depth. The other anchor came back and started discussing how Tyus Jones has performed in playoff situations throughout his career. He was explaining how Jones has been in big games, how he's played meaningful minutes for playoff teams, and how that experience would be invaluable for the Knicks. The anchor was making this point about how when you get to the playoffs, you need guys who have been there before and won't be overwhelmed by the moment. The first anchor then brought the conversation to Tom Thibodeau and whether he would embrace adding a player like Jones. He was explaining how Thibodeau is known for riding his starters heavy minutes, but how maybe having a trustworthy backup like Jones would give him confidence to play his bench more. The anchor was arguing that Thibodeau's reluctance to play his bench is partly because he doesn't trust them, and adding someone like Jones would solve that problem. The female anchor got back in there and started talking about the defensive side and whether Jones would fit into the Knicks' defensive scheme. She was explaining how Jones isn't known as an elite defender, but he's smart and rarely makes mistakes on that end, and how the Knicks need players who understand defensive principles. She made this point about how the Knicks' defensive problems against the Pacers weren't about talent, they were about effort and communication, and Jones would help with both. The other anchor jumped in and started talking about the competition for Jones' services in free agency. He was explaining how multiple teams will be interested in a veteran point guard like Jones, and how the Knicks would need to sell him on their championship window and their culture. The anchor was making this argument about how the Knicks need to be aggressive in free agency because they can't just rely on the draft to fill their needs. The first anchor started wrapping things up by talking about the urgency of the Knicks' situation. He was explaining how they just lost an embarrassing game to the Pacers, how they have a tough matchup against the 76ers coming up, and how they need to make moves to improve their roster. The anchor was arguing that signing someone like Tyus Jones would be exactly the type of smart veteran move that playoff teams make. Yo, what's happening, everyone? So I need to tell you about what went down on First Take this morning, because honestly, I was completely caught off guard by where this conversation went, and I'm still processing everything that was discussed. I had just finished scrolling through social media, seeing all the drama with Jordan Clarkson going back and forth with Knicks fans on Twitter, made myself some coffee to wake up properly, turned on ESPN to see what the hot takes would be, and there were Stephen A. Smith, Shannon Sharpe, and Mad Dog Russo getting ready to discuss the New York Knicks and their roster construction. But instead of just talking about Jordan Clarkson's frustrations with his role or breaking down their recent blowout win over the Celtics, they pivoted into this absolutely wild discussion about whether the Knicks should be pursuing Kawhi Leonard from the LA Clippers to give their team that superstar talent they need to compete for a championship. And man, the way this entire segment unfolded had me sitting there completely riveted, because they were covering everything from the Knicks' need for a true number one option to their championship aspirations to whether trading significant assets for an injury-prone star like Kawhi makes sense when you're trying to build a contender in the Eastern Conference. Hey, what's up everyone? Real quick before we get into everything, that like button is literally what determines if this reaches hundreds or thousands of fans. Takes 1 second, but makes a huge impact on the channel's growth. Just smash that like button right now. It's the easiest thing you can do, but honestly the biggest way to support this content, every single like pushes this further, so hit it now. The show opened in this really unexpected way, because instead of immediately jumping into the Kawhi Leonard discussion, Stephen A. started by breaking down the Jordan Clarkson situation and why it represents a bigger problem for the Knicks. He had this frustrated look on his face and he goes, "Now listen, Jordan Clarkson is on social media going back and forth with Knicks fans. He's clearly frustrated with his role. And you know what that tells me? It tells me the New York Knicks don't have enough star power on this roster." And you could tell by the way he paused that he was about to make a major point, Stephen A. Continued, "The reason Jordan Clarkson is frustrated is because he came to New York thinking he'd have a bigger role. But the reality is the Knicks don't have a true superstar who can carry the offensive load. So everybody's fighting for minutes and touches, and that creates dysfunction. So the question becomes, what are the Knicks gonna do to fix this problem and add that superstar talent they desperately need?" Shannon Sharpe immediately jumped in and he started breaking down the Knicks roster and identifying where they fall short compared to the true championship contenders in the Eastern Conference. Shannon was talking about how the Knicks have a really good team with solid role players and great defense, but when you look at teams like the Celtics and the Cavaliers and the Pistons, those teams have legitimate superstars who can take over games in crunch time. Shannon made this really compelling point about how Jalen Brunson is a really good player and an all-star, but he's not a top 10 player in the league, and if you want to win championships in today's NBA, you need at least one guy who's in that elite tier. Mad Dog came in absolutely fired up, and he was yelling about how the Knicks have been stuck in mediocrity for too long, and they need to make a bold move that shows they're serious about competing for championships. He brought up how Knicks fans are tired of being good but not great, how they're tired of making the playoffs and losing in the first or second round, and how they need a superstar who can elevate this team to legitimate contender status. Mad Dog was really emphasizing how the window to win in the NBA is short, and the Knicks need to take advantage of having this solid core by adding that missing piece. Stephen A. brought the conversation specifically to Kawhi Leonard, and this is where things really got interesting. He started breaking down Kawhi's situation with the Clippers and why he might actually be available this offseason. Stephen A. was talking about how the Clippers just traded Paul George, how they're clearly in a transition phase, how Kawhi has dealt with so many injuries over the past few years, and how the Clippers might be willing to move him if the right offer comes along. Stephen A. was explaining how the Knicks with their draft capital and young players could potentially put together a package that makes sense for both teams. Shannon jumped back in and started talking about the fit from a basketball perspective and why Kawhi Leonard would be perfect for what the Knicks are trying to do. He was breaking down how the Knicks pride themselves on defense and physical play, and Kawhi is one of the best two-way players in NBA history when healthy. Shannon made this point about how Kawhi could be the Knicks' best offensive player while also being their best defender, and that kind of two-way dominance is exactly what championship teams are built around. Shannon was really emphasizing how adding Kawhi would instantly make the Knicks one of the favorites to come out of the Eastern Conference. Mad Dog interrupted and he started talking about the injury concerns with Kawhi Leonard and whether the Knicks should be worried about trading significant assets for a player who's been so injury prone. He was explaining how Kawhi has missed huge chunks of the last several seasons, how he's constantly dealing with knee issues, and how that's a massive risk for any team considering trading for him. Mad Dog was making this point about how the Knicks can't afford to mortgage their future for a player who might only be available for half the season, or who might break down in the playoffs when they need him most. Stephen A came back and he argued that the reward is worth the risk when you're talking about a player of Kawhi Leonard's caliber. He was explaining how when Kawhi is healthy, he's still one of the 10 best players in the world, how he's proven he can be the best player on a championship team, and how the Knicks haven't had a player of that caliber in decades. Stephen A was making this passionate argument about how sometimes you have to take calculated risks to win championships, and trading for Kawhi would be exactly that type of calculated risk. Shannon got back in there and he started talking about what it would actually cost to acquire Kawhi Leonard from the Clippers. He was speculating about different trade packages, talking about how maybe it would take RJ Barrett and multiple first-round picks, or maybe it would take Julius Randle and draft capital, or maybe some combination of young players and picks. Shannon was being realistic about the fact that the Clippers aren't just gonna give away a former Finals MVP for nothing, but he was also saying that Kawhi's value has decreased because of his injury history and age. Mad Dog jumped in and started talking about how adding Kawhi Leonard would specifically impact the Knicks' culture and locker room. He was explaining how Kawhi is known for being quiet and reserved, how he's not a rah-rah type of leader, but he leads by example with his work ethic and performance on the court. Mad Dog was making this point about how the Knicks need that kind of quiet confidence and professionalism, and Kawhi could set the tone for how the team operates. Stephen A then shifted the conversation to talk about the Jordan Clarkson situation and how it connects to potentially trading for Kawhi. He was explaining how Clarkson is frustrated because he doesn't have a clearly defined role, but if the Knicks had a true superstar like Kawhi who could handle the bulk of the offensive load, it would actually make everyone else's roles clearer. Stephen A was arguing that Clarkson's frustrations are a symptom of a bigger problem, which is the lack of a true number one option, and Kawhi would solve that problem. Shannon came back and he made an interesting point about how the Knicks coaching staff would utilize Kawhi Leonard in their system. He was talking about how Tom Thibodeau is a defensive-minded coach who demands accountability and effort, and Kawhi is exactly the type of player who fits that mentality. Shannon was explaining how Thibodeau could design the defense around Kawhi's elite perimeter defense, while also giving him the freedom to create offensively, and that combination would make the Knicks incredibly difficult to beat. Mad Dog started getting animated again, and he was talking about what the Knicks' starting lineup would look like if they successfully acquire Kawhi Leonard. He was painting this picture of having Jalen Brunson and Kawhi as your two best players, surrounding them with elite defenders and role players who understand their roles, and how that would give the Knicks the kind of star power and depth they need to compete for championships. Mad Dog was making this point about how that kind of roster would immediately vault the Knicks into the conversation as one of the best teams in the Eastern Conference. Yo, what's happening, everyone? So I need to tell you about what went down on SportsCenter this morning, because honestly, I was completely caught off guard by where this conversation went, and I'm still processing everything that was discussed. I had just finished reading about all the buyout market candidates available for NBA teams, including guys like Kevin Looney, Kevin Love, and Kyle Anderson, made myself some coffee to wake up properly, turned on ESPN to catch the latest basketball news, and there was the SportsCenter crew getting ready to discuss the New York Knicks and their plans for adding depth before the playoffs. But instead of just running through the typical big man candidates that everyone's been talking about, they pivoted into this absolutely wild discussion about whether the Knicks should be pursuing Cam Thomas, who just got waived by the Brooklyn Nets to solve their bench scoring problems. And man, the way this entire segment unfolded had me sitting there completely captivated, because they were covering everything from the Knicks' offensive struggles with their second unit to their need for shot creation to whether signing a pure scorer like Thomas makes sense when you're trying to maintain defensive identity and team chemistry. Hey, what's up everyone? Real quick before we get into everything, that like button is literally what determines if this reaches hundreds or thousands of fans. Takes 1 second, but makes a huge impact on the channel's growth. Just smash that like button right now. It's the easiest thing you can do, but honestly the biggest way to support this content. Every single like pushes this further, so hit it now. The show opened in this really interesting way because instead of immediately jumping into the Cam Thomas discussion, the SportsCenter anchors started by breaking down the Knicks' current roster situation and identifying their biggest weakness. They were talking about how the Knicks just made moves to acquire Jose Alvarado and how they freed up some cap space with the Precious Achiuwa trade and how they're positioned to add another player through the buyout market. The anchors were explaining how the Knicks feel really good about their starting lineup with Jalen Brunson, Josh Hart, Mikal Bridges, OG Anunoby, and Karl Anthony Towns, but their bench scoring has been a major issue all season long. One of the anchors jumped in and started breaking down the statistics about the Knicks' bench production and why it's been such a problem. He was talking about how the Knicks have one of the worst bench scoring units in the entire NBA. How they struggle to generate offense when Jalen Brunson sits down, and how that's going to be a massive problem in the playoffs when rotations tighten up and you need guys who can create their own shot. He made this really compelling point about how championship teams need multiple players who can get buckets, and right now the Knicks are too dependent on Brunson carrying the offensive load. Another anchor came in and started talking about the specific situations where the Knicks struggle offensively. She was explaining how when Brunson goes to the bench, or when the offense gets stagnant in the half court, the Knicks don't have anyone who can just go get a bucket in isolation. She was breaking down how their offense relies so heavily on ball movement and player movement, which is great when it's working, but when defenses lock in during playoff basketball, you need guys who can create their own shot and bail you out of possessions. The first anchor brought the conversation specifically to Cam Thomas, and this is where things really got interesting. He started explaining Thomas's situation with the Nets and why he just got waived. He was talking about how Thomas is a pure scorer who averaged over 20 points per game last season, how he's one of the best shot creators in the league, but how the Nets decided to waive him because of fit issues and defensive concerns. The anchor was really emphasizing how Thomas is now available on the buyout market and multiple teams are going to be interested in signing him. The female anchor jumped back in and started talking about why Cam Thomas would be such a perfect fit for what the Knicks need offensively. She was breaking down how Thomas can score from all three levels, how he's deadly in pick and roll situations, how he can create his own shot off the dribble, and how he would give the Knicks exactly what they're missing from their bench unit. She made this point about how having Thomas come off the bench would take so much pressure off guys like Josh Hart and Mikal Bridges, who aren't natural shot creators. The other anchor interrupted and started talking about the concerns with Cam Thomas and why some people think he wouldn't be a good fit for the Knicks. He was explaining how Thomas is known as a ball stopper who doesn't pass much, how he's a defensive liability, and how Tom Thibodeau is a defensive-minded coach who might not want a player like that on his roster. The anchor was making this point about how the Knicks have built their identity on defense and effort, and Thomas doesn't really fit that mold. The first anchor came back and argued that the Knicks need to weigh the pros and cons and decide if the offensive firepower is worth the defensive concerns. He was explaining how in the playoffs, games slow down and become more half-court oriented, and having a guy who can just go get you 15 to 20 points off the bench could be the difference between winning and losing close games. He was making this passionate argument about how you can hide defensive liabilities when you have other good defenders around them and the Knicks have enough defensive talent to cover for Thomas. The female anchor got back in there and started talking about how Cam Thomas would specifically fit into Tom Thibodeau's rotation. She was explaining how Thibodeau could use Thomas in specific offensive-heavy lineups, how he could bring him in when the Knicks need a scoring burst, and how he wouldn't necessarily need to play huge minutes to be effective. She made this point about how championship teams often have specialists who play specific roles, and Thomas could be exactly that type of specialist for the Knicks. The other anchor jumped in and started talking about the buyout market competition and which other teams might be interested in Cam Thomas. He was explaining how teams like the Lakers, Heat, and Sixers are all looking for scoring help, and the Knicks are going to have to sell Thomas on why New York is the best fit. The anchor was making this point about how Thomas is from New York and grew up in the area, so there's a natural connection that could help the Knicks land him. The first anchor then shifted the conversation to talk about the cost-benefit analysis of signing Cam Thomas. He was explaining how Thomas is available without giving up any assets through trade, how the Knicks can sign him to a buyout deal without sacrificing draft picks or young players, and how that kind of value is exactly what teams need when they're trying to add depth without mortgaging the future. He was arguing that even if Thomas doesn't work out perfectly, the Knicks aren't losing anything by taking a chance on him. The female anchor came back and made an interesting point about how Jalen Brunson would benefit from having Cam Thomas on the roster. She was talking about how Brunson is carrying such a huge offensive burden right now, how he's playing heavy minutes and creating almost all of the Knicks' offense, and how having Thomas would allow Brunson to play fewer minutes during the regular season and stay fresh for the playoffs. She was explaining how championship teams manage their stars' workloads, and adding Thomas would help with that. The other anchor started getting more analytical, and he was talking about the offensive schemes and how Cam Thomas would fit into what the Knicks do. He was explaining how the Knicks run a lot of pick and roll with Brunson, how they use a lot of ball movement and player movement, but how sometimes they need someone who can just ISO and get a bucket when nothing else is working. The anchor was making this point about how Thomas excels in those ISO situations and would give the Knicks a different dimension offensively. The first anchor brought up the bench scoring statistics again and really drove home how bad the Knicks have been in that area. He was showing numbers about how the Knicks rank near the bottom of the league in bench points per game, how they struggle when their starters sit, and how that's been a consistent problem all season long. He was arguing that signing Cam Thomas would immediately address this glaring weakness and make the Knicks a much more balanced team. The female anchor jumped back in and started talking about the playoff implications of adding a scorer like Cam Thomas. She was explaining how in playoff basketball, games become more individual oriented and you need guys who can create their own shot when the defense locks in. She was breaking down how the Knicks struggled in past playoff runs when they couldn't generate offense outside of Brunson, and how Thomas would give them another option in those crucial moments. The other anchor came back and started discussing the locker room fit and whether Cam Thomas's personality would mesh with the Knicks culture. He was talking about how the Knicks have built a really strong team culture based on toughness and defense, how guys like Josh Hart and OG Anunoby set the tone with their effort, and whether Thomas would buy into that mentality. The anchor was making this point about how talent is great, but chemistry matters, especially in New York where the media scrutiny is intense. The first anchor then brought the conversation to Tom Thibodeau and whether he would actually use Cam Thomas if they signed him. He was explaining how Thibodeau is notoriously stubborn about playing guys who don't defend, how he has a short rotation in the playoffs, and whether Thomas would actually see meaningful minutes or just sit on the bench. The anchor was arguing that it would be pointless to sign Thomas if Thibodeau isn't going to play him in the situations where the Knicks need scoring. The female anchor got back in there and started talking about how other buyout candidates compare to Cam Thomas. She was going through names like Kevin Looney, Kevin Love, and Kyle Anderson, explaining what each player would bring to the Knicks, and arguing about whether a big man or a scorer makes more sense for their needs. She made this point about how the Knicks already have good big man depth with Karl Anthony Towns, Mitchell Robinson, and Jericho Sims, so maybe adding scoring punch makes more sense than adding another big. The other anchor interrupted and started talking about the defensive concerns again because he clearly wasn't convinced that Thomas would work. He was yelling about how the Knicks' identity is defense, how Tom Thibodeau has built this team to be one of the best defensive units in the league, and how adding a guy who's known as a defensive liability could undermine everything they've built. He was passionate about how you can't just ignore defense in the playoffs. Yo, what's going on everyone? So I need to tell you about what happened on First Take this morning because I'm still thinking about it hours later, and honestly, it completely changed my perspective on what the Knicks should be doing right now. I had just poured myself some coffee, sat down to catch up on some basketball news, flipped on ESPN, and there were Stephen A. Smith, Shannon Sharp, and Mad Dog Russo getting ready to dive into this intense conversation about the New York Knicks and whether they should be pursuing Bruce Brown. And man, the way this entire segment played out had me absolutely glued to the screen because they were covering everything from the Knicks' recent moves at the trade deadline to their current roster construction to what this team still needs if they want to be legitimate championship contenders in the Eastern Conference. Hey, what's up everyone? Real quick before we get into everything, that like button is literally what determines if this reaches hundreds or thousands of fans. Takes 1 second, but makes a huge impact on the channel's growth. Just smash that like button right now. It's the easiest thing you can do, but honestly the biggest way to support this content, every single like pushes this further, so hit it now. The show opened in this really compelling way because instead of immediately jumping into the Bruce Brown discussion, Stephen A started by recapping what the Knicks did at the trade deadline with the Jose Alvarado acquisition. He had this thoughtful expression on his face and he goes, "Now listen, the New York Knicks made a smart move getting Jose Alvarado to be their backup point guard, but let me ask you something." And you could tell by the way he paused that he was about to make a really important point. Stephen A continued, "Is that enough? Did they do enough at the deadline to actually compete with the best teams in the Eastern Conference? And if the answer is no, what should they be doing right now to address their remaining weaknesses?" Shannon Sharpe immediately jumped in and he started breaking down what happened to the Knicks in their recent loss to Detroit and why that game exposed some serious issues with their roster construction. Shannon was talking about how when OG Anunoby went out with foul trouble and wasn't on the floor, the Pistons were able to attack the Knicks' lack of size and physicality and just dominate them on both ends of the floor. Shannon made this really compelling point about how the Knicks have built this identity as a tough, physical, defensive-minded team under Tom Thibodeau, but when certain players aren't available, that identity completely falls apart because they don't have enough depth at the wing and forward positions. Mad Dog came in absolutely fired up and he was yelling about how the Knicks have been so close to breaking through and becoming a legitimate championship contender, but they keep falling short because they don't address all of their needs. He brought up how the buyout market is about to heat up with several quality players becoming available, and the Knicks need to be aggressive and add someone who can actually help them win games in the playoffs. Mad Dog was really emphasizing how you can't just rely on your starting five to carry you through an entire playoff run. You need depth, you need versatility, and you need guys who can step up when your starters are in foul trouble or dealing with injuries. Stephen A brought the conversation specifically to Bruce Brown, and this is where things really got interesting. He started breaking down Brown's career and why he would be such a perfect fit for what the Knicks are trying to do. Stephen A was talking about how Bruce Brown was a crucial piece on that Denver Nuggets championship team a couple years ago, how he's a guy who can defend multiple positions, how he brings toughness and physicality that perfectly aligns with Tom Thibodeau's defensive philosophy, and how he's the type of player who doesn't need the ball in his hands to impact winning. Stephen A was really emphasizing how rare it is to find players who are willing to do all the dirty work, who can guard the other team's best perimeter player, who can rebound from the guard position, and who understand their role and execute it at a high level. Shannon jumped back in and started talking about the defensive side of things and how Bruce Brown would specifically help the Knicks on that end of the floor. He was explaining how the Knicks already have a really good defense when their key players are healthy and on the court, but they need more depth and versatility in their defensive schemes to match up with the elite offensive teams in the Eastern Conference. Shannon made this point about how Bruce Brown is exactly the type of defender who can switch onto multiple positions, who can fight through screens, who can close out on shooters, and who brings that kind of intensity and competitiveness that you need in playoff basketball. Shannon was really hammering home the idea that defense wins championships, and adding another elite defender like Bruce Brown would only make the Knicks tougher to score against. Mad Dog interrupted and he started talking about the offensive side and how Bruce Brown would fit into what the Knicks are trying to do on that end of the floor. He was explaining how the Knicks don't need Bruce Brown to be a primary scorer or a guy who creates his own shot. What they need is someone who can knock down open threes when the defense collapses on Jalen Brunson, someone who can make the right pass and keep the ball moving, someone who can cut to the basket and finish around the rim. Mad Dog was making this point about how Bruce Brown has shown throughout his career that he can do all those things. He's a smart basketball player who understands spacing and timing, and he would fit seamlessly into the Knicks' offensive system without needing plays run for him. Stephen A came back and started talking about the buyout market and why the Knicks are in such a great position to add someone like Bruce Brown without having to give up any assets. He was breaking down how after the Jose Alvarado trade, where they were able to shed salary by moving Yabusele, the Knicks now have the financial flexibility to add a player on the buyout market immediately without having to wait. Stephen A. was explaining how this is a huge advantage because they can be aggressive and move quickly to sign someone before other teams have a chance to get involved, and Bruce Brown would be exactly the type of player who should be at the top of their list. Shannon got back in there and he started talking about the chemistry and fit aspect of adding Bruce Brown to this Knicks roster. He was making this interesting point about how the Knicks have built a really strong culture under Tom Thibodeau where guys play hard, they compete on every possession, and they hold each other accountable. Shannon was explaining how Bruce Brown is exactly the type of player who would thrive in that kind of environment because he's shown throughout his career that he's willing to sacrifice for the team, he's willing to do whatever it takes to win, and he brings that kind of championship experience and mentality that would only strengthen the culture the Knicks have built. Mad Dog jumped in and started talking about the playoff implications of adding someone like Bruce Brown to this Knicks roster. He was yelling about how in the postseason, when rotations tighten and every possession matters, you need players who have been there before, who understand what it takes to win at the highest level, and who can perform under pressure. Mad Dog was making this point about how Bruce Brown has championship experience from his time in Denver. He knows what it's like to play in big games, and that kind of experience is invaluable when you're trying to make a deep playoff run. Mad Dog was really emphasizing how you can't underestimate the value of having guys on your roster who have won before and know what championship basketball looks like. Stephen A. then shifted the conversation to talk about the specific matchups in the Eastern Conference and how Bruce Brown would help the Knicks against the other elite teams. He was breaking down how the Celtics have multiple wing scorers who can attack you from different angles, how the Bucks have Giannis and Damian Lillard who both require different defensive approaches, how the Sixers have Joel Embiid and Paul George who can dominate games. Stephen A. was explaining how having Bruce Brown would give the Knicks more options defensively to match up with all these different offensive threats, and that versatility is crucial in a 7-game playoff series where you need to make adjustments from game to game. Shannon came back and he started talking about the depth chart and where Bruce Brown would fit in the Knicks' rotation. He was explaining how Bruce Brown could play alongside the starters when they need more defense and toughness. He could lead the second unit and provide stability when the bench players are on the floor, and he could close games in crucial moments when you need your best defenders out there to get stops. Shannon made this point about how that kind of versatility and ability to play in different roles and lineups is exactly what championship teams need, and the Knicks would instantly become a deeper and more complete team with Bruce Brown on their roster. Mad Dog started getting animated again, and he was talking about the urgency of the situation for the Knicks and why they need to act fast if they want to sign Bruce Brown. He was explaining how once players hit the buyout market, they have their choice of where they want to go, and there are going to be multiple contending teams interested in adding someone with Bruce Brown's skill set and experience. Mad Dog was yelling about how the Knicks need to pick up the phone immediately. They need to make their pitch, they need to explain why New York is the perfect fit for him, and they need to close the deal before someone else does. Stephen A. brought up an interesting point about what the Knicks could offer Bruce Brown that other teams might not be able to. He was talking about how New York is obviously a huge market with incredible fans and media attention, how the Knicks have a legitimate chance to compete for a championship this season with the roster they built, and how playing for Tom Thibodeau could help Bruce Brown showcase his defensive versatility and potentially earn a bigger contract in the future. Stephen A. was explaining how all of these factors could work in the Knicks' favor when they're making their pitch to Bruce Brown and trying to convince him to sign with them over other interested teams. Shannon jumped back in and started talking about the financial aspect of this potential signing and why it makes so much sense for the Knicks from a cap management perspective. He was breaking down how the Knicks would be adding Bruce Brown on a veteran minimum contract, which means they're getting a high-level contributor who can help them win games without taking up significant cap space. Shannon made this point about how smart team building is about finding value wherever you can, and signing a player of Bruce Brown's caliber for the minimum would be an absolute steal that would give the Knicks incredible value and help them maximize their roster without breaking the bank.
All right, so I'm at the laundromat yesterday afternoon just trying to get my clothes washed because my washer at home is broken, and I've got my phone out scrolling through social media while I'm waiting for my stuff to finish. ESPN notification pops up about the NBA trade deadline, And I'm like, oh man, let me see what went down. So I open up the ESPN app and start reading all the trade, and then I decide to just put on ESPN radio through my headphones to get the full breakdown. First take comes on, and normally I might not pay super close attention because I'm at the laundromat and kind of distracted. But then I hear Stephen A. Smith start going absolutely crazy about all the moves that happen, and I'm like, all right, I need to actually tune into this because yesterday was absolute madness. So I really focus on what I'm hearing while I'm sitting there watching my clothes spin. And there's Stephen A. on the show with Mad Dog Russo and Molly Karam. And you can tell from how animated they are that they're about to break down every single trade from deadline day. Hey, what's up everyone? Real quick before we get into everything, that like button is literally what determines if this reaches hundreds or thousands of fans. Takes 1 second, but makes a huge impact on the channel's growth. Just smash that like button right now. It's the easiest thing you can do, but honestly, the biggest way to support this content. Every single like pushes this further, so hit it now. Stephen A. opens the segment by talking about the New York Knicks trading Precious Achiuwa to the Chicago Bulls for Jalen Terry late last night. He's going on about how this was purely a salary dump move by Leon Rose. The Knicks needed to get off Achiuwa's $5.8 million contract for next season, so they'd have more financial flexibility to re-sign guys like Mitchell Robinson and Landry Shamet, and potentially bring in another piece on the mid-level exception. Stephen A. says the interesting wrinkle here is that, according to Fred Katz, who covers the Knicks for The Athletic, the deal technically isn't official yet because the Knicks are still searching the market to see if they can loop this trade into a bigger multi-team deal. Mad Dog is nodding along and he says, yeah, the Knicks have 8 tradable second-round picks right now, plus that Washington Wizards protected first-rounder that's probably going to convert into 2 future second-rounders, since the Wizards just traded for Anthony Davis and aren't going to make the playoffs, so the Knicks have plenty of ammunition to make another move if something becomes available. Then Stephen A. starts listing off all the different players the Knicks have been connected to as potential targets. He mentions Jose Alvarado from the Pelicans, who's been linked to New York since mid-December. There were even reports that a deal was almost done at one point, but it fell through. Stephen A. says the Knicks have made it clear they want a backup point guard. They don't seem to trust Tyler Kolek to be ready for that role yet, and Alvarado would be perfect as an energetic defensive guard who can run the second unit. He also talks about Yves Missi, who's the young center from the Pelicans, and Nick Richards from the Sun, both guys who could provide depth behind Mitchell Robinson, who has a pretty extensive injury history. Stephen A. says the Knicks are just a Mitchell Robinson rolled ankle away from having to play Ariel Hukporti heavy minutes in a playoff series, and that's not a position you want to be in. Mad Dog says that makes sense. You need insurance at the center position, especially in the playoffs, when things get physical. Molly jumps in at this point and asks about some of the other names that have been mentioned. Stephen A. brings up Najee Marshall from the Mavericks, who the Knicks have been gauging interest in. But he says it'll be really tough to match his $9 million salary without including Mitchell Robinson, which the Knicks obviously aren't going to do. He also mentions Haywood Highsmith from the Heat, who's a versatile wing defender, though he's 29 years old, so he's not exactly young. But he's the type of scrappy defender who can guard multiple positions, which fits what Tom Thibodeau loves. Mad Dog says the problem with all of these guys is that the Knicks are hard-capped below the second apron, so they can't take back more salary than they send out, which really limits what they can do in terms of trade. But then Stephen A. pivots to something that really caught my attention and made me actually pause loading my clothes into the dryer. He says, but you know what? With all these trades happening around the league yesterday, there's one move that the Knicks should have made but didn't, and that's trading for Jared McCain from the Philadelphia 76ers. When I hear this, I'm like, wait, what? Jared McCain to the Knicks? I hadn't even heard his name mentioned in any Knicks rumors at all. Stephen A. explains that McCain got traded yesterday from the Sixers to the Oklahoma City Thunder for a first-round pick plus 2 second-rounders, and he thinks the Knicks should have been all over that deal. Stephen A. starts breaking down why this would have made sense for the Knicks. And honestly, the more he talks about it, the more I'm like, okay, I can actually see the logic here. He says, look, McCain was a lottery pick, or right outside the lottery in last year's draft. He's a young shooting guard with really good shooting ability, and the Knicks desperately need perimeter spacing and bench scoring. Stephen A. says McCain shot over 40% from 3 in college at Duke. He has NBA range, and he'd be perfect coming off the bench providing instant offense when the starters need rest. He talks about how the Knicks' bench has been pretty thin all season, especially in terms of pure shooting, and adding a young shooter like McCain would give them another weapon to deploy in different lineup combinations. Mad Dog immediately asks how realistic this would have been for the Knicks to actually pull off. Stephen A. says the Knicks definitely had the assets to get McCain. They could have offered the Bulls pick they just got in the Akua trade, plus a couple of their second-rounders, and that probably would have been competitive with what Oklahoma City gave up. He says the problem is that McCain hasn't really played much this season in Philadelphia because there's a logjam at guard with Tyrese Maxey and Kelly Oubre and Quentin Grimes all getting minutes, and McCain's also been dealing with some injury issues. Stephen A. says, but that's exactly why you buy low on a guy like this. He's a talented young player who just needs an opportunity and a change of scenery, and the Knicks could have provided that. Mad Dog says, yeah, but the Thunder gave up a first-round pick, which is a pretty steep price for a guy who's barely played, so maybe the Knicks didn't want to go that high. The conversation shifts to talking about all the other trades that went down yesterday. Stephen A. goes through the major deals one by one, starting with Ayo Dosunmu, going from the Bulls to the Timberwolves for Rob Dillingham, Leonard Miller, and 4 second-round picks. Stephen A. says he's been begging the Knicks to trade for Ayo for years. He made a video back in 2023 about a perfect trade deadline scenario that included the Knicks getting Dosunmu, and now he's gone to Minnesota, and the Knicks missed out on him. He talks about how Ayo is exactly the type of two-way guard the Knicks need. He can defend multiple positions, he can handle the ball, he can shoot a little bit, and he would have been perfect in their system. Mad Dog says, yeah, but Minnesota gave up a lot for him with 4 second-rounders plus 2 young players, so maybe the Knicks didn't want to pay that price. Stephen A. also brings up the massive Warriors trade, where they finally moved Jonathan Kuminga after years of rumors. He says Golden State sent Kuminga and Buddy Hield somewhere in exchange for Kristaps Porzingis, who's been injured pretty much all season. And this is just another example of the Warriors completely botching the end of Steph Curry's career. Stephen A. gets really animated about this, talking about how Steph is still playing at an MVP level, and the Warriors keep making these lateral moves that don't actually make them better, and at some point Steph needs to demand a trade if he wants to win another championship before he retires. Mad Dog agrees and says, yeah, the Warriors have been mismanaging their roster for years now. They keep trying to have it both ways by competing now while also developing young players, and it's not working. Molly asks them to talk about the James Harden for Darius Garland trade between the Cavaliers and Clippers. Stephen A. says this is absolutely wild. You're going to have a James Harden and Donovan Mitchell backcourt in Cleveland, which is going to be really interesting to watch. He talks about how both guys are ball-dominant scorers who need the ball in their hands to be effective, so it'll be fascinating to see how they mesh together. Stephen A. also mentions that the Clippers are getting Garland, who's a much younger point guard, on a better contract, so this could be a smart move for them if Garland can return to his all-star form. Mad Dog says the defense is going to be a problem, though. With Harden and Mitchell together, neither guy is known for being a stopper, so the Cavs better hope they can just outscore everybody. They also discuss the Celtics getting Nikola Vucevic from the Bulls. Stephen A. says Boston was already the best team in the East, and they just got even better by adding a center who can stretch the floor and score from all 3 levels. He talks about how Vucevic allows the Celtics to play a true 5-out lineup where all 5 guys on the court can shoot threes, which is going to be impossible to defend. Mad Dog says, yeah, the Celtics are operating at a championship level right now, and this trade just puts them over the top. The rest of the East better watch out. The conversation continues, and they start going through some of the smaller trades. Stephen A. mentions Tyus Jones going to the Hornets. He says Charlotte is collecting guards like crazy right now. They also got Kobe White and Mike Conley in separate deals, and it's kind of bizarre what they're doing. He talks about the Lonzo Ball trade where he went from Cleveland to Utah and is expected to be bought out, and Stephen A. says the Knicks should absolutely be interested in signing Lonzo if he hits the buyout market, because he can defend and he can play the backup point guard role. Mad Dog says that would make a lot of sense. Lonzo's not the same player he was before all his injuries, but he can still contribute as a role player. Stephen A. also brings up the Lakers trading Gabe Vincent and a second-rounder to the Hawks for Luke Kennard. He says this is a great trade for LA. Kennard is an elite shooter who can space the floor and knock down catch-and-shoot threes, and playing alongside guys like Luka Doncic and LeBron James, who are great playmakers, will create tons of open looks for him. Mad Dog says, yeah, the Lakers needed more shooting, and they addressed that need. This is the type of smart role-player move that contending teams should be making. They also discuss the massive trade between the Mavericks and Wizards, where Anthony Davis went to Washington. Stephen A. says this is interesting because the Wizards are clearly tanking, but they took on AD's contract, and it's unclear if he's even going to play for them this season. He mentions that D'Angelo Russell also went to Washington in the deal, and he's expected to be bought out. And the Knicks should definitely monitor that situation, because Russell could provide some scoring punch off the bench. Mad Dog says, but Russell has been so inconsistent throughout his career, you never know which version of him you're going to get, so it's a risky signing even for the minimum. Molly brings up the Jaren Jackson Jr. trade, where he went from the Grizzlies to the Jazz. She mentions that the Knicks have been interested in Jaren Jackson for a while. They've made offers to Memphis in the past, so they must be disappointed that he went elsewhere. Stephen A. says absolutely, Jaren Jackson would have been perfect for the Knicks as a versatile big who can protect the rim and stretch the floor, but the Jazz gave up 3 future first-round picks plus other pieces to get him, and the Knicks probably weren't willing to go that high. Mad Dog says yeah, 3 first-rounders is a massive price to pay, even for a player of Jackson's caliber, especially when you have other needs across your roster. The segment continued, and they circle back to talking about Jared McCain and why the Knicks should have pursued him more aggressively. Stephen A. really gets into it, talking about how the Knicks' offense can get stagnant at times. They rely so heavily on Jalen Brunson and Karl Anthony Towns to create everything, and they need more players who can space the floor and knock down shots. He says McCain would have been perfect for that role. He's young, so he fits the timeline of building around Brunson and Towns. He's on a rookie contract, so he's cheap, and he has the shooting ability to really open things up for the offense. Mad Dog pushes back and says, but McCain is also a defensive liability. He's undersized at 6'2", and Tom Thibodeau typically doesn't play guys who can't defend, so maybe that's why the Knicks weren't interested. Stephen A. fires back and says, but that's the thing. You can hide a guy defensively if he's giving you elite shooting, and McCain has the potential to be a 40% three-point shooter at the NBA level. He talks about how the Knicks have OG Anunoby and Mikal Bridges, who are both elite defenders, so they can afford to have one weak link defensively if that guy is providing major value on offense. Mad Dog says that's fair, but you're also talking about giving up a first-round pick for a guy who's unproven at the NBA level, and that's a big gamble, especially when you're trying to compete for a championship right now. They also discuss the financial implications of trading for McCain. Stephen A. mentions that the Knicks are hard-capped below the second apron, which means they have very limited flexibility in terms of taking on salary. But McCain is on a rookie-scale contract that only pays him like $3 or $4 million a year, so the money would have worked easily. He says the Knicks could have included Dalen Terry, plus a couple of second-rounders, and that probably would have been enough to get McCain from the Sixers before Oklahoma City swooped in. Mad Dog says, but once the Thunder put a first-round pick on the table, it probably became too expensive for the Knicks to match. Molly tries to get them to make predictions about whether the Knicks will make any more moves before the buyout market. Stephen A. says he thinks there's a good chance the Knicks sign Lonzo Ball if he gets bought out by the Jazz, and they might also look at D'Angelo Russell depending on what other options are available. He says the Knicks are clearly trying to add depth before the playoffs. They know they have a good team, but they need more bodies to get through a 7-game series against teams like Boston or Milwaukee. Mad Dog says he thinks the Knicks are pretty much set with their roster. They might add one guy from the buyout market, but they're not going to make any major changes at this point. The segment starts winding down, and they both kind of summarize their positions on the McCain situation. Stephen A. says the Knicks missed an opportunity to add a young, talented shooter who could have helped them both now and in the future. And he thinks Leon Rose might regret not being more aggressive in trying to get him. Mad Dog says he understands that perspective, but he also thinks the Thunder gave up too much for an unproven player, and the Knicks were smart to not overpay just to make a move. Molly thanks them both. The show goes to commercial. I'm standing there at the laundromat, folding my clothes, just trying to process everything I heard. And honestly, I'm kind of torn on the Jared McCain thing. On one hand, I can totally see Stephen A.'s point that McCain is a young shooter with potential who would have fit a need for the Knicks coming off the bench. And his rookie contract makes him really affordable, which is important for a team that's already paying big money to Brunson and Towns and Anunoby and Bridges. Having another perimeter threat who can knock down threes would definitely open up the offense and create more space for Brunson to operate and Towns to work in the post. But on the other hand, I can also see Mad Dog's point that McCain is unproven. He barely played in Philly because of the guard logjam and injury issues, and giving up a first-round pick for a guy like that when you're trying to compete for a championship right now seems risky. The Knicks have other more pressing needs like backup point guard and center depth, and maybe they were right to focus on those positions instead of taking a flyer on a young shooter. Whether they should have pursued him more aggressively or not is debatable, but one thing is clear: the NBA trade deadline was absolutely insane yesterday, with deals happening left and right, and the Knicks ended up being pretty quiet compared to other teams, which might frustrate their fan base that wants to see more aggression from the front office. Okay, so I'm at home yesterday afternoon, just doing my own thing, catching up on some stuff I had to take care of, and I've got the TV on in the living room with ESPN playing in the background like I always do. I'm not really paying attention at first because I'm distracted with other tasks, but then I hear Stephen A. Smith's voice getting louder and more animated. And you know, when Stephen A. starts raising his voice like that, something interesting is about to be said. So I stop what I'm doing, and I walk over to actually watch what's happening on First Take. Molly Karim is at the desk with Stephen A. and Mad Dog Russo, and you can tell from the energy in the studio that they're about to get into something that's going to generate some serious debate. The graphics on the screen say something about the New York Knicks and their recent winning streak, and I'm thinking, okay, this should be good, because the Knicks have been such a roller coaster this season. Hey, what's up, everyone? Real quick before we get into everything. That like button is literally what determines if this reaches hundreds or thousands of fans. Takes 1 second, but makes a huge impact on the channel's growth. Just smash that like button right now. It's the easiest thing you can do, but honestly, the biggest way to support this content. Every single like pushes this further, so hit it now. Stephen A. starts the segment by talking about how the Knicks have completely turned their season around over the past couple weeks. He's going on about how, just a little while ago, everyone was panicking about this team. They went 2-9 during a stretch that looked absolutely disastrous. There were reports about players not getting along, questions about the coaching, concerns about Karl Anthony Towns not fitting in, all of this chaos. But then, Stephen A. says something shifted. The team had some kind of internal conversation or meeting or whatever you want to call it, and since then, they've rattled off 6 straight wins, including a huge victory over the Lakers on national television. He's talking about how guys like Landry Shamet and Josh Hart stepped up in a massive way, how OG Anunoby has been playing great basketball, and how even though Jalen Brunson and Kate didn't have their best offensive games against LA, the team still found a way to win because everyone contributed. Mad Dog is nodding along, and he jumps in to say, yeah, the Knicks are playing much better basketball right now, but we can't forget that they're only in this position because they went through that terrible stretch where they looked completely lost. He says the Knicks are still the 2nd seed in the Eastern Conference behind Detroit, and while that's impressive, it doesn't change the fact that this team has some serious questions that need to be answered before the playoff. Mad Dog talks about how the Knicks don't have enough depth, how they're too reliant on their starters playing heavy minutes, and how if 1 or 2 guys get hurt or go cold, the whole thing could fall apart again, just like it did during that 2-9 run. Then Stephen A. does that thing where he pauses and looks directly at the camera, and you know something big is about to come out of his mouth. He says that according to sources he's been talking to around the league, the Knicks are not just sitting back and being satisfied with how they're playing right now. They're actively exploring ways to get better before the trade deadline. And specifically, Stephen A. says the Knicks have had internal discussions about potentially trading for Jusuf Nurkic from the Phoenix Suns. When I hear this, I literally do a double take, because that's not a name I was expecting at all. Jusuf Nurkic to the Knicks? That seems random at first, but then Stephen A. starts explaining the logic, and honestly, the more he talks about it, the more it starts to make sense. Stephen A. says the Knicks have a glaring weakness that's been exposed multiple times this season, and that's their interior defense and rebounding when Mitchell Robinson isn't on the floor or when he's dealing with foul trouble. He talks about how the Knicks don't have anyone behind Robinson who can really protect the rim and control the paint against physical team. Stephen A. says when you look at the Eastern Conference and you think about teams the Knicks are going to have to beat in the playoffs, you've got the Pistons with Jalen Duren, who's an absolute beast on the boards. You've got the Bucks with Brook Lopez, who can stretch the floor and protect the rim. You've got the Sixers with Joel Embiid when he's healthy. And the Knicks need someone who can match up with those kinds of players when Robinson is out. Mad Dog interrupts, and he's got this skeptical expression on his face. He says, Stephen A. Jusuf Nurkic has been terrible this season. He's been a disaster in Phoenix. He's slow, he can't defend in space, and he's constantly in foul trouble. Mad Dog says the Suns have been trying to get rid of Nurkic for months now because he doesn't fit their system, and he's not producing at the level they need him to. Mad Dog says if the Knicks are looking to upgrade their front court depth, there have to be better options out there than a guy who's been one of the worst starting centers in the league this year. Stephen A. doesn't back down, though. He comes right back and says, Mad Dog, you're looking at this the wrong way. He says, yes, Nurkic has struggled in Phoenix, but that's because he's in a terrible situation for his skill set. Stephen A. explains that the Suns want to play fast. They want to space the floor. They want their center to be able to switch on the perimeter and protect the rim. And Nurkic can't do all of those things. But the Knicks don't need him to do all of those things. Stephen A. says the Knicks run a more traditional half-court offense under Tom Thibodeau. They emphasize defense and rebounding. They play at a slower pace. And Nurkic would fit that system much better than he fits what Phoenix is trying to do. He continues by breaking down what Nurkic would bring to the Knicks. Stephen A. talks about Nurkic's size and physicality, saying he's 6'11", 275 pounds, and he can bang with anybody in the paint. He says Nurkic is an elite offensive rebounder. When he's engaged, he's got good hands and can catch lobs and finish around the rim. And he's actually a pretty decent passer out of the post, which would fit well with how the Knicks like to move the ball. Stephen A. says, if you bring Nurkic in as your backup center behind Mitchell Robinson, you're getting someone who can give you 15 to 20 solid minutes a night, someone who can match up physically with the bigger centers around the league and someone who has playoff experience and knows what it takes to win in big moments. Molly jumps in at this point and asks why the Suns would be willing to trade Nurkic and what the Knicks would have to give up to get him. Stephen A. has answers ready for both questions. He says the Suns are desperate to move Nurkic because his contract is a burden on their cap. He's not producing, and he doesn't fit their system at all. Stephen A. says Phoenix would probably be willing to take back almost anything just to get off Nurkic's salary and create some flexibility. He mentions that the Knicks could probably put together a package centered around someone like Jericho Sims, or maybe a combination of players like Tyler Kolek and a second-round pick, and that might be enough to get Phoenix interested. Mad Dog challenges this by saying, but the Knicks don't have a ton of cap space either, and taking on Nurkic's contract would limit their flexibility moving forward. Stephen A. fires back and says, but that's the whole point. The Knicks are in win-now mode. They're not worried about flexibility 3 years from now. They're worried about winning a championship this season. He says, if taking on Nurkic's contract for this year and next helps you win a title, you do it without hesitation, because championships are what matter, not having cap space to maybe sign someone good in free agency down the line. The conversation shifts to talking about Mitchell Robinson and how Nurkic would fit alongside him or behind him in the rotation. Stephen A. says Robinson is great when he's healthy and playing well, but he's also incredibly foul-prone, and he's had injury issues throughout his career. Stephen A. says if Robinson gets hurt in the playoffs, or if he gets into early foul trouble in a game, the Knicks need someone they can trust to come in and hold down the fort, and right now, they don't have that guy. He says Precious Achiuwa has been okay, but he's undersized for a true center. Jericho Sims is athletic, but limited offensively, and the Knicks need someone with more size and experience. Mad Dog says, okay, but if Nurkic is the answer to that problem, why hasn't any other team traded for him already? He says the Suns have been shopping Nurkic for months, and nobody wants him, and that should tell you something about how the rest of the league views him. Mad Dog says if Nurkic was actually a valuable player who could help a contending team, somebody would have already made a move for him. Stephen A. says, but that's because most teams are looking at Nurkic's performance in Phoenix and assuming that's who he is as a player, when really, he's just in a bad situation that doesn't maximize his strengths. They spend some time discussing Nurkic's statistics and what they tell us about his season. Stephen A. mentions that Nurkic is averaging around 9 points and 9 rebounds per game, which aren't terrible numbers, but his efficiency has been poor and his advanced metrics are really bad. Mad Dog uses this to support his point that Nurkic isn't good anymore, but Stephen A. counters by saying those numbers are down because he's playing in a system that doesn't suit him and because his role has been diminished in Phoenix. Stephen A. says, if you put Nurkic in New York where he'd have a clearly defined role and where the system fits his skill set better, his production would go back up to where it was when he was in Portland. Molly asks them to talk about how the Knicks locker room would handle bringing in someone like Nurkic, especially after they just went through that rough patch where there were questions about chemistry and guys getting along. Stephen A. says, that's actually a great point, and it's something the Knicks would need to consider carefully. He says Nurkic can be a bit of a hothead. He's been involved in some on-court altercations over the years, and you'd need to make sure he's bought into being a role player and not causing any drama. But Stephen A. says, from what he's heard, Nurkic is a professional who wants to win, and if you put him in a situation where he's contributing to a contender, he's going to be fine. Mad Dog isn't totally convinced. He says the Knicks just got their chemistry back after that 2-9 stretch, and the last thing they need is to bring in a new player who might disrupt that. Mad Dog says sometimes the best move is no move at all, especially when you're playing well and you've got momentum going in the right direction. Stephen A. disagrees strongly with this. He says complacency is how you lose in the playoff, and if the Knicks think they can just ride what they have right now without making any improvements, they're going to get bounced in the second round at best. The conversation continued, and Stephen A. brings up the fact that the trade deadline is coming up soon, and the Knicks need to decide what direction they want to go. He mentions that there have been reports linking the Knicks to several different players, including Jose Alvarado from New Orleans, Yves Missy also from the Pelicans, and some other role players around the league. Stephen A. says if he's the Knicks, he's making multiple calls and exploring every option to upgrade the roster, and Nurkic should absolutely be one of those options, even if he's not the sexiest name available. Mad Dog brings up an interesting point about positional fit. He says the Knicks already have Karl Anthony Towns, who's supposed to be their starting center, even though he's playing more as a power forward. They have Mitchell Robinson, who's their traditional rim-protecting center, and they have Precious Achiuwa, who can play both forward and center. He says adding Nurkic to that mix creates a logjam where you've got too many big men and not enough minutes to go around. Stephen A. says, but that's a good problem to have. You want to have depth at that position, especially in the playoffs when physicality matters, and you need guys who can spell each other. They also talk about Tom Thibodeau's coaching style and whether Nurkic would thrive under him. Stephen A. says Thibs is known for being a defense-first coach who demands effort and toughness, and Nurkic, when he's engaged, can bring both of those things. He says Thibs would probably love having a big body like Nurkic who can set hard screens, crash the offensive glass, and bang with people in the post. Mad Dog says yeah, but Thibs also has a reputation for running his guys into the ground, and Nurkic is already dealing with some wear and tear on his body from years of playing heavy minutes. Stephen A. makes an interesting point about the Eastern Conference landscape and why the Knicks need to be thinking about matchups. He talks about how the Pistons are the top seed right now, and they've got Jalen Duren, who's a physical freak and one of the best young centers in the league. Stephen A. says if the Knicks have to play Detroit in a 7-game series, they're going to need someone who can match up with Duren physically and not get pushed around. He says Mitchell Robinson can do that to some extent, but what happens if Robinson picks up 2 quick fouls in the first quarter? You need someone else who can step in and hold the line. Mad Dog concedes this is a good point, but he says there are other ways to address that problem besides trading for Nurkic. He mentions that the Knicks could look at other centers who might be available, or they could just try to play smaller and faster to neutralize size disadvantages. Stephen A. says, but that's not who the Knicks are. They're built to play big and physical, and going away from that identity in the playoffs would be a mistake. The conversation shifts to talking about the financial side of a potential Nurkic trade. Stephen A. mentions that Nurkic is making around $18 million this season and has another year left on his contract after this one. He says for the Knicks, that's actually not a terrible number for a quality backup center, especially if he's someone who can contribute in the playoffs. Mad Dog says yeah, but that's also money they could use to sign someone in free agency or to extend one of their own guys down the line. Stephen A. says, but again, you're in win-now mode. You can't be worried about free agency 2 years from now. Molly asks them to make predictions about whether this trade is actually going to happen or if it's just speculation. Stephen A. says he thinks there's about a 50-50 chance the Knicks make a move for Nurkic. He says it's not a lock by any means, but he's heard enough to believe that the Knicks are seriously considering it and not just kicking the tires. Mad Dog says he thinks it's less likely than that, maybe 25%, because he doesn't think the Knicks want to disrupt the chemistry they've just gotten back, and he doesn't think Nurkic is good enough to be worth the risk. They spend some time wrapping up by talking about the Knicks' overall trajectory this season. Stephen A. says the Knicks are in a great position. They're the 2nd seed in the East. They've got 2 All-Stars in Jalen Brunson and Karl Anthony Towns. They've got solid role players, and they're playing their best basketball at the right time. He says if they can add 1 or 2 more pieces before the deadline to shore up their depth, they have a legitimate chance to make the final. Mad Dog agrees that the Knicks are a good team, but he's not convinced they're good enough to beat the Pistons or even the Bucks if both teams are healthy. He says the Knicks need to be realistic about where they are and make smart decisions that actually move the needle. The segment ends with Molly thanking them both and teasing more Knicks coverage throughout the week. As the show goes to commercial, I'm sitting there thinking about everything they just discussed. Jusuf Nurkic to the Knicks is definitely not something I saw coming, but after hearing Stephen A. and Mad Dog debate it for 30 minutes, I can see both sides of the argument. On one hand, Nurkic has clearly struggled in Phoenix, and there are legitimate concerns about whether he's still a productive NBA player. On the other hand, if you believe the issue is more about fit than ability, then maybe putting him in New York's system with Thibs coaching him could revitalize his career and give the Knicks exactly what they need in terms of interior depth. What really stuck with me from the segment was Stephen A.'s point about the Knicks needing to be aggressive and not settling for what they have. The Eastern Conference is wide open this year, and if the Knicks truly believe they can win a championship, they need to be willing to make moves that improve their roster, even if those moves come with some risk. Nurkic might not be the perfect solution, but if he can give them solid backup center minutes and provide some physicality against the bigger teams in the East, that could be the difference between making a deep playoff run and getting bounced early. I'm definitely going to be paying attention to what the Knicks do over the next few days leading up to the trade deadline. They've been connected to so many different players, and it feels like something is going to happen, even if it's not Nurkic specifically. The Knicks are in a good spot right now with their winning streak, but as Stephen A. said, you can't just be complacent and hope everything works out. You have to keep pushing to get better. And if that means taking a chance on a guy like Nurkic, who might be able to help you in a specific role, then maybe that's what you do. It's going to be fascinating to see how this all plays out.